one day flows into the next.
Ah,
Nice to see you.
it's perfect timing.
Oh, beautiful
right here
weather,
for
too.
the introduction of the executive director of the Sag Harbor Whaling and Historical Museum is joining us today. So
My pleasure.
thank you.
My pleasure. Welcome.
Well, can we
So-
go inside and take a look
Please.
and tell us all about
Absolutely.
the museum?
Happy to bring you inside.
Oh, okay, and so
So here's our fabulous jawbone of a right whale. So visiting here, one can imagine being swallowed by the whale.
you've heard us
Doesn't hurt a bit.
Jonas, so
Doesn't hurt a bit. Yeah,
Go right
colossal
in.
jawbone. Quite wonderful.
I like to point that out to school children when they're coming
Right.
through and being swallowed up by the whale. You know. So that's fun. And the other thing that it strikes me as a kind of indicative of the scale of the country. We have what are a couple of them hanging here on the wall. They're typically referred to as Mediterranean passports. And what it amounts to is a pre-printed piece of paper, which, as the captain of a ship, you would want this in your possession as you're going out on a voyage, because you're going to be out in the middle of an ocean somewhere. And if a hostile craft approaches you, you want to be able to identify who you are and that you are, in fact, sailing under the full protection of the United States of America. Now, of course, in the early years, we didn't have a Navy that was actually going to go out and be able to protect you from much of anything. But at least this was something of value.
but
This-
we did have pirates.
We did have pirates. We
We
still
had-
have
yeah,
pirates.
amazing.
Now, whether they paid attention to this or not, I'm not sure. But we have them. This is signed by all the presidents: John Adams,
My goodness.
Andrew Jackson. We have Washington and Thomas Jefferson, etc. But the extraordinary thing, I think, is that this actual document had to go to Washington, D.C. on a horse. It had to be signed by the president by hand. It then had to be brought back to Sag Harbor on a horse and given to the captain. And at that point, he could go off on his voyage with this certificate in his possession that perhaps would serve him some purpose or other. So I'm just thinking, at that point, the president hadn't yet delegated the authority to sign these certificates to somebody else. You know?
Right.
So this was part of his paperwork every day, signing. And there were ships leaving other ports. Sag Harbor, of course, was just one of many ports. So I find that kind of amusing and indicative of the scale of government, which some people would wish we were back in those days, I guess, so that the president could just sit there and sign these things. In any event, these are quite wonderful to have.
It
We
might
also-
save us a lot of money if they weren't
Yeah.
signing so many bills.
So many, right, exactly. We also have things that are called, these are shipping papers, and they would list the entire crew of a whale ship that was going out, starting with the captain and working all the way down to the lowest fellow on the totem pole. And this was kept very close, kind of this organization of the crew, because the pay that you received at the end of the voyage was proportionate to your level of responsibility within the crew. And these were called lays. The lays were the shares in the profit. Of course, the man who owned the ship got the biggest portion of the profit.
Right.
And then the captain, the master of the ship, would then get a large portion.
Yeah,
And
I
each
see
of
he
these-
gets 1/40th.
Right.
And then down at the bottom, the workers are getting something like 1/90th,
Yeah,
1/200th.
kind of a minuscule amount. And at times, if you think that you're out on this ship, this is the company that you're with, you know, for an extended period of time. If you were only going to receive a modest amount of the share, you might end up owing the company money even after you've collected your share, because if you've lost your boots in Hawaii or you know, ran up a bill someplace, you might end up owing the company more than you'd be paid, and you were therefore obligated to pay it off somehow, which typically meant going back out on another voyage.
They got you.
Yes.
Wow.
So if you're sort of into the company. But this
So
is
much
the way
for the
all
free
this-
room and board, huh?
Well, right, free.
It's like the
Free
Hotel California, you
Ex-
never get out.
That's it. That's exactly right. Someone made a study of this a number of years ago, tracking these shipping papers and other documents that would tell you what the actual people were, and discovered that, in his estimate, fewer than 10% of the men that went out on these voyages ever went back on a second voyage. It was so dangerous. Now, some of them didn't live to get back, but the ones who did, these were, we live on an island, but it's not a little island. You know? Men on Nantucket were pretty much oriented toward the sea. That's pretty much what the economy was about. But out here on eastern Long Island, we have farming, we have other ways of making a living. So most of these men didn't swim. They had no direct, to begin
Water,
with.
yeah,
You know,
experience.
and so off they'd go because there was some romance involved in this. Of course, you'd see the world, and there was a paycheck at the end of this experience. But if you were 17 or 18 when you went off on one of these things, and you were 20 or 21 when you came back, and you had very little to show for it except the experience of being there, arguably you would say, why would I want to do that again?
Right.
So it was difficult to get the crew.
And keep it crew.
And keep a crew. And the other thing that's interesting about this is that in a port town like this, the crew that would come back with a ship invariably was not entirely the one that went out to begin with. Someone might be lost at sea, someone might jump ship and decide that they're just going to go AWOL somewhere, and maybe they'll show up later somewhere. And so the ship needed to hire new hands on deck during the course of the voyage. And so that is why when the ship comes back in, you have a kind of a multi-racial, multi-ethnic kind of, and that had to be okay in this town because of course everyone is organizing themselves around the profit of these whaling and other shipping interests. So I think that's one of the explanations why this town becomes quite cosmopolitan, very open-minded, whereas some of the other neighboring communities that were really more farming based, much more homogeneous in terms of the people who lived there, who married one another, who that was a more homogeneous population. Whereas Sag Harbor has people coming from all nationalities, all ethnicities, etc., coming back in, and at times settling here. The Portuguese, for example, Native Americans were very active in the whaling trades, as were the native black population. So it was kind of a much more open-minded, and I think that shows.
That still permeates today
I
in
think
Sag
so.
Harbor.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, and I find that's
Yeah.
interesting because there's a historical reason for that. People realized that this was their profit, and the whaling interests had to succeed the best they could, and so people were less inclined to be concerned about someone not looking familiar.
Right.
You know? So,
Now
so
that's
quite
very
interesting.
politically correct.
Very politically correct, yes. We've been ahead of that for a long time. So, yes.
And here's a ship. Who did this? This is
Well, yeah,
fascinating.
we have some early models. This one in particular, I don't have a date on it, but I would date it to the early 1900s.
Okay.
And it is of a whale ship. We also have my friend Mr. Jefferson over here,
Okay.
and he was the figurehead off of the whale ship Jefferson, as you might imagine. So he was saved. Many
So
of
there
these-
was no mermaid. You
There was
had
no
Jefferson.
mermaid, we just have Jefferson, it's the only one we've got. A lot of these whale ships, well, I should start over. Few of them were commissioned for the whaling, for whaling purposes, because speed was not the issue. So in other words, you didn't need a brand spanking new ship to spend weeks or months getting out to the South Pacific and bobbing around in search of whales. I mean, speed was not the issue. It was just sort of getting there and being there and continuing as long as you. So oftentimes whale ships were older vessels that were repurposed, re-rigged perhaps, for that purpose. And so by the time they got to the end of their whaling years, they were pretty well spent. So we believe there's probably quite a few whale ships that were sunk out here. You know, if something came back and had no useful life, it would just be burned to the waterline and allowed to sink. So that explains why we don't have the ship, but we've got Mr. Jefferson right off the front. Right? Yep.
This is beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah.
So, and this over here, this is really interesting, from Alaska to Siberia.
Yeah. Again.
And they were brought in?
Well, these again. Most of these objects The Whaling Museum started in the 1930s and advertised among the local citizens to see if they could find some objects of interest that were perhaps up in their attic, etc. And so many of these Eskimo-related are thought to have been brought back, again, just as the ethnographic materials there on the wall from the Pacific, brought back in the 1820s, 30s, 40s as souvenirs from an exotic place. And, you know, including this wonderful mask.
That mask is so terrifying, isn't it?
Real teeth. Yeah, he's
It had human teeth
creepy,
pasted in.
creepy guy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Captain Roy.
And a smile, no less.
He has a bit of a smile. Yeah,
Right.
he's sticking out his tongue at you.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yep.
So, well, let's go to another.
Okay, we can head to. Very hard to.
Oh, isn't that interesting? I don't know if you can get that or not, but it
If
has
you
a
can
sailboat.
The image in it.
Uh-huh. And it's signed, isn't it? Or front?
Yeah,
It says
maybe
front something.
can't quite read it there.
Mhm.
If we got it in the right light, we could see it.
Uh-huh.
This has a whaleboat. Here's a whaleboat. Here's the whale ship. American flag.
Uh-huh.
But this is, again, baleen. This is a natural substance, very much like your fingernail. There are two categories of whale, if you will. The toothed whale
Yes.
and the baleen whales.
Oh,
And the baleen whales have no teeth. They have a mouth full of these long plates. There's another one over here behind you, much longer one.
yes.
And attached, hanging off of this, they're missing here, because this is a very early piece,
Uh-huh.
but hanging off of these large plates are long, thin hairs. So in the mouth, there'd be this
Uh-huh.
mouthful of these plates with,
Wow.
with these little hairs.
Uh-huh.
And the way the baleen whale eats is it gulps up a mouthful of water,
Mhm.
and then it squishes it back through these little hairs,
Uh-huh.
which trap the krill and little tiny
Little
creatures.
tiny things.
Little tiny things.
Yeah.
And that's what it swallows for its protein. Whereas the toothed whale goes out and gobbles
Chops
things
down
up with its teeth.
Right.
So there were some practical uses for this material. This was a period, of course, before plastics, as
Mhm.
we know they were developed later. And this was a naturally flexible substance that would be used to make certain household objects. But as you can see, this big plate was just used as a for decorative purposes.
It looks like a piece of wood, actually.
It does look like wood,
But
but
it's
and I don't
actually
want to
actually-
flex it too much,
No.
but it does
Yeah.
flex. That big one flexes better. So yeah, it was kind of a natural plastic substitute for plastic before that was invented.
So they used most of the pieces of the whale.
Yes, yeah. And interestingly enough, the only whaling, of course there are international whaling treaties and laws to protect the species, especially the endangered ones, of course. But even within that, what's known as aboriginal whaling is still permitted. And that applies to these native cultures, which still oftentimes either part
That's
of
to
their
keep them
culture.
from eating humans?
Well, I don't know if they eat them. I suppose they must eat them, yeah. But it's part of their religion or their native beliefs. And of course, this is all being done by hand, and so this is not considered to be a major threat to the
Right.
whale population of the world. If you have a native group somewhere that's going out, rowing out,
Right.
and attempting to kill a single specimen once every year or so. This is
Mhm.
not, so that's known as aboriginal whaling, and that is permitted. I suppose they use it all up. Maybe they eat it.
Mhm.
They must.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Yeah. Here comes the music, man. He heard there was a camera coming, and he came right over.
Let's take a picture of the music man.
Are you feeling like being photographed?